And is there anything that you know is not particularly good for your gut, but you still just occasionally really crave it and you'll have it?
I quite like ham-flavoured crisps, but because I don't eat ham, you see, but I quite like I know there's no ham in it.
Hello and welcome to a special filmed edition of the Spectator's food and drink podcast, Table Talk. I'm Lara Prendergast, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Spector. Tim is a leading professor of genetic epidemiology at King's College London and a renowned expert in the fields of nutrition, gut health and the microbiome. He is the founder of the Zoe Project, which focuses on personalised nutrition and understanding how individual responses to food affect health. And with over 30 years of research experience, Tim has authored several best-selling books, including Spoon-Fed and The Diet Myth, where he challenges conventional diet wisdom and highlights the importance of diversity in our diets. His new book, the Food for Life Cookbook, is his most extensive yet, taking an in-depth look at all the scientific evidence on what we eat, how we eat it, and how we can use this knowledge to improve our own personal nutrition. Tim, welcome to Table Talk.
It's a pleasure to be here.
We always start this podcast at the beginning. What are your earliest memories of food?
Earliest memories of food would probably be school dinners, I think. When I was young, I lived in Australia, and they had little tuck shops in the infant school. So in the playground, there was actually a little sweet shop, which was actually in the playground. You could buy licorice. That was my. I still remember the licorice. I really enjoyed those treats as well as. So it wasn't the healthiest food that I remember from my first memories.
And what were meal times like for your family?
They were meat and two veg, basically, so very classical Anglo-Saxon cuisine. My father's British, my mother Australian, so meat was a big feature, and we had a few basic vegetables. My mother did start having an allotment, so the quality of the vegetables was probably quite good looking back at it. But we also were very excited to have some of the first UPF foods, ultra-processed foods. I do remember the excitement of trying Angel Delight for the first time, which was a powdered dessert that supposedly revolutionized the life of housewives everywhere. So they didn't have to spend ages baking. They could just mix it up. So we had a few horrible things mixed with some good stuff, but it was certainly nothing exceptional. Certainly no gourmet cuisine in our house. And my mum was famous for being able to burn peas, which no one else's mum seemed to be able to do that.
With those two influences, the English and the Australian side, were you aware of the differences in the foods between those two countries, and did that start to come through at the dinner table?
Well, we spent about a year as kids in Australia, and the thing that did strike us is the huge amounts of meat they were eating in the time then in Australia in the 1960s. So you'd have steak for breakfast and other things like this, just because they had so much lamb and beef. And the concept that anyone would be vegetarian would be completely bonkers. You'd have to be some religious fanatic to give up your meat or your fish, I think, in that culture.
You went to University College School in London, and after that you then trained in medicine at St Bart's Hospital. What are your memories of food from those two periods of your life?
Medical school was basic, trying to exist on as little money as you possibly could in order to save it up for going on holidays, and I still saved up to go doing expensive skiing holidays, which was very hard as a student. So we used to live on £3 a week, and basically however you could get through, you did. So big bags of muesli, going to Smithfield Market and getting the worst possible cuts of meat or beef, and curries, vegetable curries. You just keep going for a week just by adding more leftovers to it. Was a student feature, and of course, becoming a junior doctor, then it was all about eating in the hospital canteen, which was cheap, but usually very large portions. So you could have, spaghetti and chips and egg and chips and lots of sausages and fry-ups. And it was all fairly revolting, but very filling. And you always had to eat very fast if you're a junior doctor. So that's one thing you do get trained in medicine, is to be able to finish your meal before you have to answer your bleep. So yeah, it was a pretty bad time. But what's interesting, during that time, I did, as a junior doctor, I did have a year in Brussels. So I did an exchange scheme, and that was quite a revolution, really. So suddenly realizing how the other half lived, and the patients had, choice of different wines with their food, and it was restaurant quality everywhere, and it was chalk and cheese, really. It was like you'd couldn't believe the difference. So it was very hard to come back from Brussels, which also had amazing restaurants, very high quality food, back to the East End of London to continue my training. That definitely was a shock. And then really from that point, I just drifted into eating, back in the British style, really bad sandwiches, deal meals, terrible breakfast cereals, but all the time thinking I was pretty healthy.
Could you talk about whether there's a particular memorable meal or experience that perhaps sort of significantly changed your perspective on food and health? What was the moment when you started to sort of go down that route and realise that what we eat obviously really does affect our health in a very significant way?
I don't really recall any one meal, but it was certainly one event in my life, which was 2011, when I was 52, and I'd been doing ski touring in Italy and Austria, and it was the last day, and I reached the top of this mountain and had really bad double vision, and just about made it down to the valley, and my blood pressure had shot up, and I turned out I had this what I call a mini stroke, which resolved. And it was only really in those 3 months when I was really depressed, thinking about how I could stop myself dying early, like my father had, of a heart attack, that it came home to me. Because I think people like myself, particularly males, feel a bit invincible, and that nothing's going to happen to them, and that if they do a little bit of sport, that's fine, and if they're gaining a kilo every year, it's probably just muscle rather than fat, and that they didn't have to worry about what they ate or did. So that was, for me, that big turning point. And from that point on, I said, I've got to do this. I don't want to have another stroke. I don't want to have a heart attack. And I was researching a new book, and it was obvious that diet was the thing that we were never taught as doctors to think about as being really important. It was taught to us as a rather trivial extra thing you might mention, but only once you've sorted all the drugs out and got the proper side of medicine sorted out. And so that was really it, and that's when I started experimenting. It wasn't like I knew what I was doing, but I immediately decided to try being a vegan for 6 weeks to see if that would kickstart my journey in a way.
Could you talk, Tim, a little bit about your areas of research, which, just for listeners who might not be aware of it, and in particular how it's influenced your own eating habits over the past few decades? I'm
unusual in medicine and science in having changed jobs quite a few times. So I started life as a rheumatologist, which is a bone and joint doctor. And then I taught myself epidemiology, did a master's in epidemiology, and went on to do a thesis in that, and was exploring why populations get certain diseases, particularly aging-related disease and arthritis, etc. Then I got into genetics and set up a twin registry of 15,000 twins in the UK. And that was all like nature v nurture, and got really into genetics. It was only later when I started looking at identical twins and realizing that because they're clones, this means they're genetic clones of each other, raised together. But whereas they look very similar and have similar personal quirks and traits, they died of different diseases and aged at different rates and had different mental illness and different cancer, etc. So that was an intriguing bit that didn't make sense from my sort of predestiny theory, and suggested that diet might be a big factor. But I found that the diets of twins weren't that different. But what was different was their gut microbes were different. And so, and this I discovered around 2011, 12, I was doing the first studies in the UK on gut microbes. And that was a bit of an aha moment, because I realized that, in a way, the microbe differences would accentuate any small differences in diet, because they would have very different effects on different people. And so I started getting engaged again in food as a really big cause of disease, which, interestingly, I had studied in the early 1980s, before the genetic revolution. That was what my epidemiology colleagues were saying, that 70% of all common diseases could be reversed by changing a population's diet. But then, as genetics came in, that theory really got kicked into the long grass. So it was coming back to that old theory again, that suddenly said, yeah, food is really important. And at the same time, we'd had all this nonsense about the fat, low fats and avoiding fats and saturated fat as being the only real thing we had to worry about, and salt. And so it was dispelling some of these ideas as we were moving forward that were really interesting. And as my work got towards the gut microbiome, I started getting more interested in food quality and how the food would actually affect your gut microbes, rather than these just focusing on how much fat or protein or carbohydrates was in the food, which is still the mainstream of government and nutritional advice.
And what are some of the challenges you've faced in trying to convince people to rethink traditional dietary advice? I mean, there's obviously so much advice out there, and as you say, often quite conflicting advice, and you yourself sound like you've obviously evolved through it as well. So how do you go about talking to people about what they should be eating?
Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Yeah, well, it's difficult because doctors are still taught it's all about calories, it's all about not exercising enough, and it's about reducing your fat levels in your blood. And that's pretty much been disproved, in the last 20 years, quite convincingly. But the world doesn't change that fast, and the food companies basically were making 30 billion a year out of us in the UK don't want that to change either, because they've reformulated their products with that message in mind, and so it would mess up their business model. So we have to face that it's very hard to shift that in government and mainstream, and you have to really appeal to individuals to just say this doesn't make sense. And so that's really why I've been writing my books since the diet myth, the last 10 years or so, to try and convince people that this is wrong and that we need to be moving on from this idea that nutrition is much more complicated than just calories and fat. And the reason we believed it is the reason we're so unhealthy. So I think it's what I'm trying to do now is so rather than focus on food being energy, which is the traditional approach, thinking of food as like fertilizer for your gut microbes, so that they're the ones that are actually the organ that's key for your body, key for your immune system, key for your brain. And if we can refocus the discussion on the gut microbes, then everything else sort of falls into place, and you can start to see, these nutritional messages very differently, and at the same time enjoy your food, because microbes enjoy good quality food. They don't really want this ultra processed low fat food either. So for me, it ticks all the boxes of getting pleasure out of food, keeping it very sociable, not having any punitive rules about it, not getting us obsessed with clean eating, etc., and providing a way for us to eat for the next 20, 30 years, not just for 6 weeks as a crash diet.
What do you like to cook for pleasure? And are there any, whether it be ultra-processed foods or sort of foods that perhaps aren't so good for your gut, that you still occasionally like to have in your diet?
Yeah, I started rediscovering cooking again after my sort of medical incident. My wife's a good cook. She's French-Belgian, but generally brought up on rich sauces, etc., and a meat eater. So I got into cooking vegetarian, plant-based meals, and I enjoy really discovering new things. I love making curries. I love using the ingredients of the fridge that just say, okay, what can I get here, that rather than throwing it away before I, just about to go away for a week, what can I make up here? I enjoy big tray bakes where you're putting lots of things together. Enjoy using new ingredients, and I particularly enjoyed testing a lot of the things in the cookbook because they mixed and swapped things around that I hadn't done. So I always like learning new things, and it was great, for example, to take my mum's old lasagna that I used to love and just tweak a few things to make it just as tasty, but actually really healthy, which is hard to do for a lasagna. So you take away the mince and you add lentils and mushrooms, and that gives you that same umami flavor and taste that the meaty sensation, and you also get plenty of protein, but added fiber. And then instead of the bechamel sauce, which was delicious but really not very healthy, which is basically flour, butter and milk, you can replace that with a creamy bean sauce. So you're best just mixing up beans, and then you still top it with lots of cheese, which you can burn and really enjoy. So I think I've really enjoyed playing with a lot of these recipes to tweak old favourites and new way of doing it. And particularly mixing fermented foods. I mean, I'm a big fan of fermented foods, but a lot of people say, oh, I don't like them, they're a bit sour, I can't get my kids to eat them. And so discovering ways that you can mix them into normal traditional foods that people are more comfortable with, I think is really exciting. So I now, anything I've got beans, I'll throw in some sauerkraut or kimchi, using on curries a kefir, milk kefir at the end rather than creme fraiche. Always having some yogurt on the side, and using miso paste instead of stock cubes, just as a sort of healthy, non-processed way of eating. So, yeah, I'm learning all the time. So I just love doing new stuff and tweaking old ways of doing it. So it's not like it's a radical, each step is a small step rather than a radical one. So that's why I'm super excited about, lots of people using this cookbook to test these principles.
And is there anything that you know is not particularly good for your gut, but you still just occasionally really crave it and you'll have it?
Oh, yes.
Go on.
Well, there are some things that are good for my gut, but I eat far too much of them. So a bowl of cashew nuts, I will just devour it if someone doesn't take them away. I find them totally addictive. Crisps, and there are a whole range of crisps from actually what I would call non-ultra-processed crisps, very expensive Spanish ones with the peel on them and only using olive oil and salt. It's only got 3 ingredients, to, the ones the most used in this country where you've got about 20 chemical ingredients. I still find they're fairly irresistible if they're offered to me. So I try not to buy. Is
there one in particular that you like? Or
I will go for, I quite like ham-flavoured crisps, because I don't eat ham, you see, but I quite like I know there's no ham in it. So
can get your hit.
But salt and vinegar, the classic ones, or things that remind me of when I was a kid. I think I used to like quavers, totally artificial, but I try not to have too many of those. And if someone offers me a digestive biscuit, I'll have that with my tea. I try not to buy a packet. That's the key, and not be surrounded by it. So I know if I was surrounded by all this tasty junk food, I would be partaking of it. So changing my own food environment is really important for me. I drink red wine, knowing that's not is frowned upon by many of my colleagues, but I've decided that it for me, it really enhances the meal and gives me great pleasure. And as long as I don't have more than a couple of glasses a night and have a night or two off a week, I think that's overall fine for my health. Some evidence that does help your gut microbes as well, drinking red wine, because of the fermented grape bits in it. So I'm absolutely not a saint. And also, if I'm in France, for example, staying in a hotel and all they've got to eat is fantastic croissants, I will eat a croissant. I think my philosophy is that 80% of the time you try and eat the good stuff, but don't let principles get in the way of a bit of good fun and enjoyment, and particularly if it's also social with friends or family. I think you've got to make changes to your lifestyle that are sustainable, and that means being able to cope with a bit of time out, so you're not worried about it. Because if you're doing the right stuff 80% of the time, then you know that your gut is getting resistant to these other stresses, and you can still be naughty every now and again.
And Tim, what for you is comfort food?
Comfort food, well, there's quite a few of them in the book, actually. So I mentioned my mum's lasagna, and that's really anything with a cheesy burnt topping. I find it. That's why I think I like all these tray bakes and things. I used to like Wiener schnitzels, but I'm not really into eating veal anymore. And so there's an aubergine equivalent, what we call a aubergine schnitzel, which is still cooked like in breadcrumbs with a nut crust, so you get that slightly burnt texture to it, which I really, really enjoy. I used to really love mashed potato, so now I've switched to something that's quite similar, which is like a bean mash, and it gives me the same sensations that I can eat. I guess they're the main ones. But I'll still have a roast every now and again. I do eat meat once or twice a month, but I find that I'm much more interested in a roast dinner in the vegetables now than the meat. But I do quite like that concept of the the roast and said, but I'm happy to have a veggie one now.
We always finish this podcast with a question about what your last or desert island meal would be. So, Tim, for you, I mean, presumably at that point you're perhaps not so worried about your gut. So, what would be your final ultimate meal? You can have whatever you want.
Mussels and chips, I think, would be my starter, and with a nice glass of Merceau white wine, and my mum's lasagna with a glass of Chateau Latour. I think that would.
Would you have the original lasagna or the adapted version?
Oh, I probably prefer the adapted version. In the past, I'd have preferred the original, and then I'd probably finish that with probably a really dark chocolate mousse. Which again reminds me of various places I've been, and certainly my Belgian gourmet experience.
Delicious. Well, Tim, thank you very much for joining Table Talk. And Tim's new book, The Food for Life Cookbook, is available now.